Hello, this is Michelle Miller, and today we're going to be talking about succession, or the changes in ecosystems over time. So in reality, ecosystems are not relatively static, but they actually change over time, and these changes are due to disturbances. And so we can classify these disturbances in the environment as being either physical or biological. So examples of physical disturbances include rain, storms, wind and rain and storms, and also droughts. So these would perhaps be physical disturbances in an environment. And then we have biotic or biological disturbances. And so these would be things that are living, like microorganisms that cause disease. They could be due to predation and perhaps herbivory, which is referred to as grazing. Okay, so these are just some examples of the disturbances that then would cause an ecosystem to change over time. So when we look at the effect of these disturbances, the effect depends upon, so the effect of the disturbances one, its spatial scale. So for example, if it is just a small storm that just topples a few trees, that would be a small area, a small physical scale or spatial scale. If it is a drought that covers a huge area, then that would be a large spatial scale. So this would be small versus large. The other thing that affects the disturbances, or the characteristic of the disturbances, is what is called the turnover rate of an ecosystem. And so some ecosystems completely are disturbed and then replaced in a short period of time. So they have a short turnover rate. So for example, some forests have a 50-year turnover rate. So what that would mean is that just by natural forces, the trees die every, on average, all the trees would have died after 50 years, and then they would then subsequently be replaced by the different species that come in and colonize the environment. So 50-year turnover rate versus, like, for example, 100-year turnover rate. So we can classify different forests on their turnover rate, and that would mean probably that if the turnover rate is lower, like it's only 50 years, that means that there's probably more disturbances, okay, in that particular ecosystem. And the third thing is the frequency of the disturbance. So some disturbances are very frequent. So for example, we could talk about fire as an example of a disturbance. And so in some ecosystems, fire is very common. And if the disturbance is very common, what tends to happen is that species tend to adapt to those particular conditions. So for example, fire is common in some ecosystems, and adaptation. So adaptations allow organisms to survive these disturbances. So that whether that be like grasses that can use their roots to store energy after the fire, or if this is like trees that have very thick bark that generally do not die in case of just a light fire that moves quickly through the forest, then those would be examples of adaptations. Okay, so if we look at this idea of a disturbance, and so this could be a wind damage by a windstorm. So in this particular instance, what this has done is this has opened up the forest floor to light. And so the next growth would be pioneer species coming in and colonizing this area. And so you might see shrubs and brushes. And then over time, we would probably see trees recolonizing this particular area. So if we look at the recovery time that it takes for an ecosystem to go back to its normal condition versus the spatial scale. So remember, the spatial scale would be like how large of an area the disturbance has occurred in. So for example, a volcanic eruption has a large spatial scale, and so the recovery rate might take 100 years. So the example that your textbook uses is Mount St. Helens. Whereas like a tree fall is a relatively small spatial scale, and so it would take a relatively few number of years in order to recover. And so that's just an example of how spatial scale influences recovery of ecosystems after a disturbance. So when we look at succession, this is what happens following a disturbance. And it is a change in the plant and animal communities over time. So a change in the plant and animal communities over time. Following a disturbance. Now, in the past, it was believed that there was like a set sequence of events that occurred, but we kind of now realize that succession is not goal-oriented, and so there's not really like the idea of like a climax community still pertains, but it's not set in stone. So, and also the pathway to developing a stable ecosystem is also very much more variable than we once believed. And so when we look at the succession in a forest, what generally happens is that we have annuals, like weedy species coming in, and then these are replaced by perennials that live longer than a year, right? So they can survive the winter. And then we go to bushes, and then we have bushes being replaced by trees. So if you think about a fire in a forest, you might be able to see this succession of different communities occurring over a given period of time. So in this idea of succession, we do have what is called a climax community. And the climax community is simply the community that tends to remain for an extended period of time. So it tends to remain for an extended period. Okay, so for example, trees in a forest are oftentimes the climax community of that forest. Now, we also see succession in aquatic ecosystems, even though we don't think of it as nearly as often. There's not many examples in a aquatic ecosystem. But when we look at the tidal pools that we talked about on the Pacific coast, you could have storms that come in and completely wipe out all the organisms living in those tidal pools, so completely removing the sea stars and the sea urchins and the sea anemones. And then you would have a recolonization of those rocks after that storm, which was the disturbance. So sometimes we see, and an example of primary succession, and this is where all of the soil has been removed from an area. So primary succession, it occurs after the soil is completely destroyed or removed. So then we even have to rebuild the soil community. So the rocks have to be broken down. And so you can think about the volcanic eruption, Mount St. Helens in the 1980 eruption. It completely destroyed some areas of soil. You could also talk about it in terms of Hawaii or the Galapagos Islands, where those just come up out of the, because of volcanic eruptions, are brand new land masses, and they have to be colonized, and so they would have to undergo primary succession. Okay, so we would say that succession does not follow does not always follow the same pattern. I'll just put the exact same pattern. Okay. So if we look at what happens after a fire, for example, so actually, yeah, so this could have been a fire, or it could just been where it was disturbed. I'm not sure. I think this is where they were actually disturbing the ecosystem on purpose, because this is a big biodiversity research site in Minnesota. And so you see that ragweed is the first one to come in, but you notice that over time, ragweed, which is really bad if you have allergies, for example, will go away. So sometimes if you dig up your yard, you are kind of really unhappy because the first things that come up after you've dug up your yard and cleared all the grass, for example, would be weedy species. And so you notice that the difference in species over time, it adjusts. And so then we get quack grass, they call it, and then we get bluegrass and little bluegrass, and then also big bluegrass. And so that's kind of the climax community would be at the end there. So this would be where they artificially create a disturbance, and then watch what comes after that disturbance. And it was you notice that in this particular experiment, they did this over many, many years. Okay, so one of the important things to realize about our ecosystem is that there are also, in our ecosystem, there are what are called microclimates. And so this would be versus macro. So when you think about a forest, you think about like the larger climate scene, right? But when you look at the microclimates, these are small variations in temperature, amount of sunlight, for example, and also humidity. So even if you're out in the desert, you can see microclimates and the importance of them really, really clearly, because the temperature underneath a bush or a tree in the desert is much, much lower than out where it's exposed to the sunlight. And then that decreases the amount of sunlight, and there actually might be more moisture underneath that. And so microclimates are really important because they can determine what species can live in a particular environment. And so if we look at these microclimates, we can look at what are called early successional species. So this is after a major disturbance. They find the bare soil, and that is hospitable to them. They grow, and they reproduce quickly. And the reason for this is probably because the environment is changing so quickly that if something happens during their lifetime, they might not be able to reproduce. So if you think about dandelions, for example, dandelions grow really fast in the springtime, and then now they're already going to seed, right? So it's just like, oh, I had dandelion flowers, which are good for bees, but now the dandelions are going to seed, and so that is an example of an early successional species. So it doesn't tend to put a lot of energy into growing because it grows quickly and it reproduces quickly. So if we look at the difference between that and late successional species, these grow slower, and they allocate more energy to storage and defense and maintenance. So they grow slower, more energy is used in storage, in growth, maintenance, and defense, because they are probably going to have a longer lifespan. So less of it is towards reproduction. So I'll just put in parentheses, less towards reproduction. Okay, so they're like, if you think about trees will grow, spend more energy growing because they're actually going to compete with access to light. So they're competing with other species, and they're going to put more energy into growth than they are into reproduction. So that's some of the differences between those early and late successional species. Okay, so if we look at how we see ecosystem changes through succession, as I mentioned before, the early successional communities tend to reproduce quickly, but they also tend to have a primary productivity. So the first thing is we talked about how plants are able to produce organic molecules from CO2 in the atmosphere and nutrients in the soil. So we would say that the net primary, so I'll write primary like that, productivity is greater in early succession communities. So think about grasses, for example. Think about weeds, okay? So this allows the biomass to accumulate quickly. The second thing that we notice as a trend is that the number of species present tends to increase with succession. So when we look at early successional communities, there is not as many species. So number of species present increases with succession. So in late successional communities, there is more species. The third thing that we find is that the amount of nutrients is greater in late successional. So the amount of nutrients. So think soil nutrients, for example, is greater in late succession communities. And this is because, for example, in early succession, you could lose a lot of nutrients due to soil erosion. So I'll just put that there's less soil erosion, right? More leaf litter. So the soil is richer. Okay, so in our gardens, we try to make the soil rich by covering the soil so that we could cover it with compost, for example, dead and decaying organic matter. to make it so that our plants will have more nutrients in the soil. Okay, so that's kind of some trends that we see in succession and the community structure. Okay, so the mechanisms. So how does succession occur? How does one species or group of species get replaced with another? And so your textbook talks about 3 particular forces. So we'll call these forces of succession. So these are things that cause succession to occur. And the first one is called facilitation. And facilitation means that as a plant or a species exists in the environment, it changes the environment and it actually makes that environment better for another species, right? So a change in the environment, it makes the presence of a species actually makes it less hospitable for their own self and more hospitable for another species, okay? So I'll say that the species makes the environment more hospitable for another species. Okay, so for example, when we look at trees and their seeds, they're actually, a tree seed that falls in bare soil is likely to be eaten by an organism. But a tree seed that falls in your lawn, for example, so if you have trees producing seeds, then you'll see in the springtime, you'll see all these seedlings pop up. And so the grasses actually made the area more hospitable to the tree seedlings. And so that's an example of facilitation. The second example of a force for succession is what is called tolerance. And this means that the ability of a species to live in a particular environment is due to its tolerance to a limiting resource. So we'll say tolerance to limiting resource affects the ability of a species to survive in that environment. So for example, if nitrogen is limiting initially, then one group of species that uses, that is very capable of getting nitrogen, like they could be legumes, so they could get nitrogen from their bacteria in their roots, is going to have an advantage initially, but as nitrogen starts to accumulate in the soil, we could have other species that are able to survive where nitrogen is more abundant. And so what we see over time is there is a change in the species distribution over time. Okay, and I think I might have a picture of that, I'm not sure. Okay, so this just actually shows that area in Minnesota where they actually planted different types of seeds in plots that contained high, medium, and low levels of nitrogen. And what happened is that successional communities were abundant, but were then replaced by the late successional species. And so the difference in nitrogen, the limiting factor, influenced what species could survive there. Okay. The last one, oops, I want to just put that on this one, sorry. The last one, we wanted 3 forces. Okay, so the third force has to do with competition. And so this is sometimes referred to as inhibition. Right? So one species inhibits the growth of another, for example. So we've been talking about plant species, but plant species sometimes correspond with the animal species that are also in the environment. And so this has to do with, in plants, they have, they produce protective or competitive chemicals, And these are called allelochemicals, or allelopathy. Oops, pathy, sorry, pathy, right? So this is the use of chemicals to have a harmful effect on another species. So use of chemicals against another species. And this is very common in like bacteria, which produce chemicals that inhibit the reproduction of other bacteria. So bacteria are constantly fighting with one another, and they have actually, that's where we get antibiotics. So bacteria produce chemicals that are harmful to other bacteria, and so then we use that information about the chemistry to our benefit to produce antibiotics. So we can use some of these chemicals that are produced by plants as herbicides. So I'll just put a possible use as herbicides. And one example would be black walnuts. So the black walnut produces in its buds and also in its nuts, produces a chemical called juglone, right? And this is toxic to some other plants, including the nightshades, which we actually grow for tomatoes and potatoes, are nightshades. So you could use black walnut shells, for example, if you wanted to mulch with that, then that would prevent some things from growing in that particular soil. Okay, so those are the three factors or forces of succession, so kind of mechanisms there. Okay, so we've talked about succession as like going from grasses to shrubs to trees, where there is just a small, small changes over time. But sometimes we can get catastrophic shifts in ecosystems. And this is particularly important in ecosystems that are not very stable. And so some disturbances cause these shifts where the next stage looks very, very different from the previous stage. And so these are catastrophic. So some disturbances cause dramatic changes in the ecosystem composition. Okay, so we could talk about this in terms of lakes. So a lake could be dominated by phytoplankton. And if it's dominated by phytoplankton, this is like algae. And so phyto means plant, plankton means drifting. And so this is in the water, and it creates a cloudy water. Okay. And this is opposed to lakes that might be dominated by submerged plants. So versus submerged plants. And this is clear water. And this is important because the water needs to be clear, because light needs to get down to the submerged plants where they can use the light energy for photosynthesis. And so the example from your book looks at how if you add phosphorus to this particular environment, that it causes a dramatic shift in the lakes and in the particular lake. And so what happens here, if we look at the phosphorus, you'll notice when phosphorus is really high, then we get a loss of vegetation. So the vegetation dies off and we get cloudy green water that is dominated by phytoplankton. And then if we decrease phosphorus, then we see that there is more plants in the lake. And so we could say that this is the catastrophic shift, that once you get to a particular point of phosphorus, that the lake will automatically go to a completely different composition. And so when we look at the maintenance of a clear water helps to decrease the amount of phosphorus that is available for phytoplankton. And so we kind of have these positive feedback loops within the system. So we could see that this is like nutrients, right? And so as we increase water fleas, then we decrease phytoplankton. Decreased phytoplankton increases water clarity. A decrease in the nutrients will actually decrease in the nutrients. I'm not sure of this one. It would increase phytoplankton. Let's see. Anyway, so the idea is this catastrophic shift that causes lakes to go from one extreme to another could be the addition of a nutrient. And that addition of a nutrient could be from a human source. Okay, so I want to close this, collapse that. Oops. Just want to get rid of that. Okay. Okay, so let's talk about the ecosystem health. So how do we know if an ecosystem is healthy? And we can kind of compare this to humans. In humans, we look at the absence of disease as health. But when we look at ecosystems, we might also look at the ability of an ecosystem to withstand disturbances. And so the health of an ecosystem might depend upon the presence of particular species that are present in the ecosystem and that maintain that ecosystem. So we could say that when we look at the ecosystem health, we could say that it is the potential of an ecosystem to withstand and recover from disturbances. Okay, so that could be a definition of ecosystem health. So how do we estimate ecosystem health? Well, some people use the presence of what are called indicator species. So the presence of indicator species. So indicator species are species that are susceptible to environmental change and would only be present, say, for example, if there was no toxins, if there was, if the ecosystem was pretty healthy, that is what would maintain the indicator species. So species that are susceptible to environmental change. So an example of this would be amphibians. So amphibians, like frogs, for example, do not have shelled eggs. And so they lay their eggs without a shell into the water. And so if the water quality is poor, or if there's chemicals or toxins in the water, then the frog's eggs would not hatch out and there would be no frog population in that given area. So when you see frogs in a pond, that gives you some indication that that pond is relatively healthy. Okay, so you could also look at insects. So dragonflies, for example, their larvae live underwater, and they are also considered to be an indicator species. And some species of fish are also considered to be indicator species. Okay. So we could also look at let's see, ecosystem health. Okay, I think I'm done with that. So I'm sorry, there's just one. We could use indicator species to estimate that health. Okay. Okay, So, oh, I wanted to mention functional groups. Sorry, I did have another one. Okay, so we'll just put two here. Okay, so one was indicator species. The second one is what we call redundancy of functional groups. Okay, so this is the idea that there are different organisms that play different roles. So let's say, for example, if there were different plants in an environment, and there were also different insects that were feeding on those plants. And so if there is only one insect that feeds on a particular plant, then if that insect goes away, the ecosystem might be at risk. But if there are many different herbivorous insects, then we would say that that ecosystem is probably more healthy because of the redundancy of that group of organisms, those insects that eat plants, eat the particular plant. And so this example that's on this diagram is in coral reefs. So we can see that in coral reefs, there are different groups of organisms that live and do different functions. So for example, we have fish that eat coral. We have fish that eat algae, so they eat big algae. We have fish that eat microinvertebrates, right? So this is the number of species. We have macro carnivores, they might eat other fish, for example. And we'll notice that in the Great Barrier Reef, if we look at the number of species of macro carnivores is larger. The number of macroalgae browsers is also larger. And so the Great Barrier Reef would be said to be healthier because it has more redundancy in the functional groups than the Caribbean Reef. Now, unfortunately, in the news recently, and this hasn't been updated in the textbook, but the Great Barrier Reef is all but died due to warming water. So a lot of they think that a good proportion of it is terminally ill, at least, because of the warming temperatures. So then this shows the different types of corals, and then notice that the different types of corals, plate-like versus massive, the number of species is greater in the Great Barrier Reef than the Caribbean. So we might say that those are healthier. And also, obviously, the Caribbean coral reefs are also at risk of dying due to climate change. Okay. So when we look at what affects these ecosystems of coral, we could look at extra nutrients here versus fishing pressure, okay? So if we get too much nutrients and we have lots of fishing pressure, then we get what is called slime, right? If we don't have very many nutrients and we get little fishing pressure, then we have rock. We don't want any of those. So what we want is a healthy reef, and that is dependent upon having a limited number of nutrients and also having low fishing pressure. And so as you increase the nutrients and increase fishing, then these are two stressors on coral reefs that are going to make the coral reef unhealthy or sick. So ecosystems become sick when they start to lose diversity of species. They become stressed and then they die and become rock. Oops, okay. So when we look at this is another diagram from your book, we can see the stability, so the resistance to change. And so what's really interesting is that the healthy state is very resistant to change. So it takes a lot to go from the healthy state to where we get macroalgae. And so this resistance has to be overcome by overfishing, or extra nutrients can cause it to go downhill. So notice how there's little resistance here and very little resistance here. And so as we stress the coral reef, there's lower resilience and lower resistance to change. And so this can make an ecosystem very unhealthy. Okay, So we can also look at how food chains affect the stability of an ecosystem. And we can talk specifically about the complexity and like if we have weak links or strong links in our ecosystem. And so when we look at the stability of a food chain or of an ecosystem depends on the interaction between species in a food chain. Okay. So if we have a weak interaction, that means that we have many different connections. So, for example, if an insect can feed on many different types of vegetation, then their connection to one plant species is very weak. So weak interactions means that a species can eat many types of food. And they are said to be generalists because they can do that. Monarch butterfly, for example, larvae are not generalists. Monarch butterfly larvae need milkweed. And you probably have maybe seen some of the advertisements for ordering milkweed and putting it in your yard so that the migrating monarch butterfly larva will have something to eat upon. So they have a strong, monarch butterflies would have a strong interaction with milkweed. Some other butterfly species, their larvae, their caterpillars can eat a wide variety, and so they have a weak link with any given one species of plant in the environment. So this would be versus a strong interaction where a species is a specialist. On one type of food. So that would be like the monarch butterfly and the milkweed. Okay. So ecosystem stability is greater where we have many weak interactions. So this increases ecosystem stability. If we have many strong interactions, that's stability. If we have many strong interactions, then if one species goes extinct, then that could cause a problem, a ripple effect, and that could destabilize your ecosystem. So from your book, they show diagrams of this. So this is the plant hopper, which feeds upon a grass. And what's really interesting about this is if we look at plant hopper density. So this is the population of density of plant hoppers. And this is plants only. Notice that the density of plant hoppers is smaller than when there are plants and herbivores, right? And then when we look at plants and herbivores plus low, so if we didn't have very many spiders, or maybe just one spider, then we would get a lower density of plant hoppers. So if we have lots of diversity in the predators, so that there's more than one predator that feeds upon the leafhopper, then the population of plant hoppers is greater. Okay, so this is the density of individual plant hoppers or leafhoppers in the population. So these would be weak interactions, because this spider, for example, could eat this spider, this spider, this spider, this spider could eat the myriad bug, this spider, the wolf spider could eat the dwarf weaver, etc. So there's many interactions. So the more complicated it is, it seems to be the more stable the ecosystem. Okay, so there is a case study at the end of this chapter in your textbook that talks about how there is disturbance in aquatic ecosystems too. And the example that they use is a lotic system. So you should know from the previous chapter that the lotic biome is actually a river or a stream. So this is biome, river, right? And we have grazers in the river. And these could be insects. And so we have what are called grazers that are resistant to predation. And you might have seen these if you've ever played in the river. These would be like caddisfly larvae. And they are resistant because they have a shell, like made of cemented pebbles. Not pebbles, pebbles. Okay. And then non-resistant grazers, non-resistant to predation, that says resistant, would be like the mayfly larva. So they do not have a shell, and that makes them more able to be eaten by fish, for example. And so what they found is that when you flood a river, the flood decreases specifically the number of caddisfly larvae. Because those larvae are typically swept away by floodwaters. And so you have an increase in prey, grazers, that can be eaten by fish. So you can actually have an increase in fish. So floods could be a disturbance in an aquatic ecosystem that would actually increase the abundance of fish, because it decreases the amount of larvae that are eating the algae off of the rocks, they're grazers, and increasing the amount of food that is for the fish. And so if we look at an image of this, so this is a non-resistant, this is the predator, right? This is the algae that they're feeding upon. This is the resistant one. And what we see over time is that flooding actually increases the number of fish in a lotic system. So it is a disturbance that increases predator density. Okay, so we're going to talk now about ecological restoration. And one of the problems with ecological restoration is that, one, it's a new science. And the second thing is that we have to determine what the ecosystem looked like prior to humans. So what does a particular ecosystem, what does it look like? What is it supposed to look like? Okay, what does an ideal ecosystem look like? Right. So we can look at pictures, for example, historical photographs, and we can say, oh, that's what the forest looked like in the 1800s. And so we could say, well, maybe that's what we need to restore this forest to look like. Okay. So where are we, what is our ideal? What is the goal of the ecological restoration? So this is a problem that we sometimes have. And the other thing is, should you look at restoring individual species, or should you look at the ecosystem as a whole? So these would be problems. I'll put problems. So are you restoring an ecosystem just for a particular species? Or do you want to restore that ecosystem so it has a particular function in the environment, like a ecological service that it might provide to us, for example? Okay, so many of the first steps of restoring an ecosystem, if we're talking about terrestrial ecosystems, is to establish healthy soil. So in terrestrial ecosystems, land, the first step is to establish healthy soil. And if we're looking at a ecosystem that's contaminated with minerals or heavy metals from mining, for example, we might actually have to bring in plants. And there are plants that they put on mine tailings, and those plants absorb the heavy metals from the soil, and then the plants die, and then they take away the plants, and that actually helps to remove the heavy metals from the soil. Okay, and then you essentially facilitate succession. Okay, and this would mean you would provide disturbances. And so sometimes people argue that, you know, going into a forest and cutting down a tree, you would stimulate a tree falling in the wind. Or when you go in and you selectively take trees out of forest, that is creating an environment for succession to occur in, right? So you might need to restore the disturbance. So might need the significant disturbances. And this is a big deal right now with our forests, because we have been preventing forest fires for so long that our forests are different ecologically than they were when we were allowing fire to burn them. So example of this would be fire in forests. Those help to maintain that particular ecosystem. Now, in your book, there's a discussion of the restoration of the Florida Everglades. So we can talk about aquatic. This is actually aquatic terrestrial. So the Everglades. And so the Everglades are really interesting because they connect a freshwater lake to the ocean. And this used to be an extensive wetland. And so we actually have a national park that you can go visit in Florida. It's in central Florida, and it connects Okeechobee Lake to the ocean. And so if we look at the historic ecosystem, okay, it would look like this. So you have these mangrove swamps with lots of diversity. This is the lake now. And so what they have done is in terms of agriculture, this is not restoration, this would have been the destruction of the ecosystem, but they diverted the waters into ditches, and then they used them for agriculture. But now what they want to do is take the water back out of the ditches and restore the wetlands. And so historically that might, historically they look like this. We had this huge wetland area that took fresh water into the Florida Bay. Now a lot of that water has been diverted to Miami and diverted to the farms. And so what they're trying to do is somehow restore this ecosystem. And it involves things like taking water away from agricultural lands, increasing the flow of water back to the bay. And also they're putting in wells to store water. So they're putting in wells so that when it rains, it stores water so that the Everglades don't dry out. Because with agriculture and the diversion of the water, what started to happen is the Everglades started to dry out, and the salinity of the bay actually increased because there's less fresh water moving into that area. And so it was affecting the whole ecosystem found here in the Florida Keys. Okay. Okay, so that is the end of the lecture on succession and its significance as well as its causes.